inner privacy of conscious experience and the quantum information. Just to make sure I shared these slides with you guys in case you want to go through it, beforehand. I will not go into the detail of each of the paper, but just pick up some of the discussion points and also something that you might find as an interesting preliminary result from our lab. And the other one is that the quantum information theoretic approach to the mind-brain problem. So both of them are quite similar. But one is most, this one in a privacy thing is more towards the philosophy side, especially Wittgenstein and John Locke and so on. And then the other one, quantum information side, is more towards the quantum information theory, as well as the molecular biology and soliton and so on, which I don't understand. Okay. So why I thought that this paper may be interesting to you guys is that firstly, I think the author's intuition about the possible commonality between quantum mechanics and the consciousness is quite compelling. And by that, what I mean is that the structural relationship between the structure of consciousness or structure of the state of the matter and the measurement is quite similar in both cases. What I mean is that when you have conscious experience and then when you try to measure it or access it by paying attention or paying, cross introspection and so on, that itself changes the state. And that's similar to quantum state that changes because of the, measurement, right? And that's one intuition. But there are lots of differences as well. And then another thing is that, upon continuation from, Ben's presentation of a couple of months or maybe 1 year ago on Hameroff and the Penrose or paper review, I think the quantum approach in general in consciousness science has been kind of, marginalized, potentially because of the, Hameroff's presentation and so on of this thing. But there are probably many interesting things there, which is not necessarily need to be marginalized. And the type of the, study or theory that this author, Georgiev, suggests is one potential reasonable kind of alternative, I think. So that's why these two reasons are the ones I kind of, picked up these papers. Okay. And just ask me a question or stop me if there is any questions, okay? So this diagram or table is kind of a comparison of the classics and also a classical and quantum kind of world. And I just basically summarize what the Georgiev was saying. So quantum physics starts, or, he says, this is a bit, controversial possibly. It consists of the unobservable state vectors, and to observe or measure it, through the operators or matrix, there is this, observable things, operators. On the other hand, the classic physics, people assume that there is a definitive state, that things are already there, no matter how you actually measure it. And so measurements effects can be minimized, arbitrarily small, and also you can measure things simultaneously in the classic world. And then one of the also important thing Georgiev points out is this determinism. So in the quantum, the classical world, things are supposed to be all determined. So one to infer the state of the t, then you can actually refer to the t+1 state, and then go back to t. That's the sort of the classical world. And then he also contrasts the quantum information and the classical information. Classical information is easy. It's something that we can communicate and read, write, store, process, copy, broadcast, and so on, and also erase. But quantum information is intrinsically unobservable and incommunicable. And it's unknown quantum states can be cloned, converted into classical, and also broadcasted and so deleted. So this is the property of the quantum information. Okay, and then I am not now expert in quantum information, and the Kavan is, so if you have any questions about this, you should ask Kavan. And quantum information exists in the quantum physical states. That's what he also says. Okay. Is there any question about this so far? All right. And then his intuition starts from here. So consciousness is like quantum information, private. You can't directly share with other people, cannot be extrinsically observed. And he uses the kind of a metaphor of observing the EEG or measure, state or shape or state activity state of the neuron doesn't actually give us the same kind of intrinsic conscious experience, feeling. So it should be different, right? And then, but state itself, like quantum state is there, and also conscious state as a sort of subject of that experience, we do feel that. So this kind of he directly says that consciousness is a quantum state from this kind of analogy. And then there is also some kind of analogy, like a limit in how much can be communicated. This part, he talks about Halev's theorem in the quantum information. Quantum state or quantum information can be communicated classically, or language, verbal, or any kind of button press, whatever. There is some kind of bound, and it's never going to the entire quantum information, qubits, and it's always bounded. That's similar to consciousness as well. What we can communicate is, aspect of consciousness, it's limited and so on. And then also measurement effects on the system. So that's the thing that I mentioned in the beginning, right? On the other hand, behavior or classical mechanics kind of are similar. It's observable from outside and not private and can be extrinsically observed. And then there's no limit in how much can be communicated, which I strongly doubt. And then measurement can be arbitrary, small in terms of its effect. Okay. And then, but yeah, Aniko?
So this is bit of a different question about measurement. Should I ask now, or do you want to talk about this measurement problem? Okay, so I was wondering actually, so do you mean, or does measurement means when someone is trying to report their conscious experience?
That's exactly the problem. I also agree with that. So I think I made some kind of notes around here. Yeah.
Oh, there was something
here. So I'm actually not sure. And also when I talked with some of the quantum physicists, they also said that what does it mean to measure is also unclear. So Kavan, please help us. What constitutes measurement? In the case of the consciousness, I'll try to explain. It would be reports, probably, and attention to conscious states, introspection, probably.
But then, okay, so when you say attention to conscious states, so for example, when an animal is listening to an external stimuli, is that actually attention to a conscious state because it's recognizing an external stimuli, right?
I don't know. I would say so, but maybe we should move a bit on.
Yeah.
I would consider that's probably a measurement. Yes.
Okay.
It's almost like a self-interaction, self-measurement, which quantum particles don't do. I mean, the biggest problem in quantum mechanics is that you need this external agent for the theory to make sense. That agent makes a measurement. Now that's already problematic because now you have this theory that is, has all these things like wave functions in unitary dynamics and so on, and then you have somebody sitting outside messing around with that theory, but that's also part of the theory. So we don't really understand what measurement is, and we try not to talk about it because it leads to problems.
I see. Okay.
So the agent has to be external entity, Kavan.
I mean, yes, for all practical purposes, yes. There are, these famous paradoxes or things like Schrodinger's cat or Wigner's friend, where the agent is then included as part of the experiment. And then I mean, quantum mechanics is fine with that. What is not fine is how do we interpret that in our, how do we interpret the physics in our world? But I should also add, I mean, in my opinion, I don't know, maybe I should run this past some experts in quantum philosophy. I think the same problem exists in classical physics, right? Where you have people like Spinoza and Descartes were worried about the fact that you have this mechanical world that is, all deterministic due to Newton's laws of motion. But how do you explain agency and free will within that? So, I mean, it's not intrinsically a quantum problem, but in quantum mechanics, the problem gets unavoidable.
About the free will, now I'll jump over many different things, but they do talk about free will, but I actually really don't understand what he is talking about in terms of free will. So maybe if we get there, we can talk about it. So yeah, he does talk about free will and the quantum, and this is the only way to kind of solve a free will problem in the mind, basically. Okay.
Yeah, I think he actually has a complete paper on free will.
Okay. All right, then shall I go on, or is there any further question?
Yes, another thing to mention in the classical world, it's deterministic if you can, with infinite precision, describe all your variables you're tracking. And there's some theory that, if there's imprecision, like on a computer, there'll be some rounding error. And if you can't track the precision at that rounding error and there's chaos, right? There are positive Lyapunov exponents that small, increments can blow up in nonlinear systems. Then even in classical physics with deterministic rules, if there's not infinite precision, it's not fully deterministic.
Yeah, so that's the one that I was going to also introduce as a sort of better perspective than this, quantum classical dichotomy. And that also leads to probably why Kavan is still, studying this, quantum and also classical physics, I think, which is that, this AERTS paper, 2005, I can also distribute it later, introduced to me by Steve. This may be the best paper I read this year, actually. But he talks about the parallel between the quantum probability and signal analysis. And this part is quite relevant to our collaboration as well, right? Ben and also Oliver, because we are talking about all signal analysis. And basically what this, paper talks about is that already, we don't need to go into the full, the very specific and very precise kind of measurement, but at the level of Fourier, decomposition, time frequency decomposition, or description of the signal in time versus description of the signal in the frequency domain, they are already a kind of the operators here, that they are the operators corresponding to the Fourier transform does not commute with the operator that yields the intensity at every instant. So if we imagine the state of the system as something, classical state of the system, and then measure it through the Fourier transform like operator, that is already incompatible with the time varying measurement operator. And the underlying incompatibility is that this Fourier and time varying operator are non-commutable. I think that's what it is, but I may be wrong in terms of reading this paper because I haven't finished reading it. But a basic idea is that even in a classical situation, there is such a thing like, one perspective is incompatible with another. And that's very similar to this quantum situation. And that's this paper, AERTS. Okay.
Sounds wild. I don't know how you find all these Wild West papers. I'll have a look.
Yeah, this was Steve's suggestion, and I think this was really great, I think. But anyway, and then I talked about this thing, right? And then I also introduced this. Yeah, and he also talks about this kind of, similarity of, yeah, so this one also made a lot of sense to me. So in the case of the quantum, state, the quantum state itself is usually, depicted as this quantum vector psi, and then it's represented as this bra and the cat. I don't use this, fancy LaTeX, but you can probably understand this. And then if your operator, which represents such as something like a position or momentum or something like that as a matrix, and then expectation or expected value of this A can be obtained by this way. So as an expected value, we can define, we can access to this state thing. And then this happens exactly in the classical case. And then now, if you jump a little bit, if you go into somewhere in terms of consciousness, then this may be also similar to consciousness as well. Like state of a consciousness itself is not possible to measure directly, but measurement of this average through some way of operator, like operator meaning that some kind of task instruction or task aspects, attended aspect, and things like that, that we can measure really reliably. And that's what we are measuring in terms of psychophysics. And this operator may not commute. Like if you attend one aspect and then the other one maybe altered, or if you try to report one aspect, you forget the other one. And that's the this non-commutativity of this operator on state of consciousness. That's the kind of part of my own idea. So it's not like the general club of this paper already, but that's what I wanted to talk about as an idea here. All right. Yeah, Nirumiti.
Can you describe, like you said, average of consciousness? What do you mean by that here?
The expected value is the sort of the average across many measurements. So you can think about it as a percentage correct or mean similarity rating or something like that.
Oh, so average of that when it comes to consciousness.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Okay.
Okay. All right. If no further question, then I'll go ahead. The other things. Yeah. So then, AERTS also start to talk about this complementarity of the perspective in many ways, which is actually also quite interesting. Whenever we talk about this, perspective kind of thing, it may be the case that this situation arises. It's like quantum probability or quantum mathematics actually is necessary. Something like he talks about the description of the house from inside or outside. If you focus the view of the house from inside, then it may become incompatible with the description from the outside. That's one thing. And also language game by the Wittgenstein, which is not precisely the thing that Georgiev talks about, but I read something about Wittgenstein recently, and then language game is a concept that Wittgenstein talks about, and he points out that the society description of the society is completely dependent on the perspective, right? If you participate in it, then the society will look from inside. And if you observe and describe the society from far, that's another society, but that's completely different kind of entity. But both of them are, logically coherent in itself. But unless you participate in it, you will never get this, intrinsic perspective of the member of the society. And this is the same as, program of the language and some meaning and things like that. So I think there can be also another parallel from the meaning and the quantum mechanics and also signal analysis actually, and also consciousness. And then, yeah, I already talked about intrinsic conscious state versus extrinsic introspection and so on. All right. And then, yeah, another thing that is very interesting in an AERTS paper is that if you read this, you might be also surprised to read around this time. So many of the signal analysis technique that is developed around 1950s and 60s and so on seem to be progressing in parallel with the development of the measurement and the concepts in the quantum mechanics. And what was very surprising was this, Gabor's discovery on this hologram and atomic representation and so on is related to this Heisenberg inequality. And Gabor is the person who talks about, who invented this Gabor patch that, every psychophysicist uses right now, right? It's basically—
He's actually Hungarian, so
oh, really?
representing, yeah.
Great.
We have a university section named of him.
Gabor University.
Well, yeah, it's Danish or Danish Gabor.
I see. Anyway, the Gabor patch or Gabor, decomposition is kind of the Fourier transform, but it's dependent on the eccentricity, so size and also frequency, and is differently decomposed than the Fourier transform. But it's also it's quite interesting from neuroscientific point of view as well. If we talk about the neuron in the visual cortex as a Gabor patch or receptive field is like Gabor patch, it always means that it's there is some kind of uncertainty in a position or amplitude and so on. So some people, I think it might be Max Tegmark wrote in some paper or book that whether the reality is in the frequency domain or the time domain or the space domain or spatial frequency domain, these are also kind of, unresolved kind of perspective issue in physics as well, right? I don't know if this is incorrect, Kavan, please correct me. But I think that's probably at least what I understand.
Yeah, so I think the duality or the Heisenberg uncertainty principle already exists in wave mechanics. And that's why I think most quantum physicists don't take Heisenberg uncertainty principle all that seriously anymore. There are more sophisticated things that don't exist in wave mechanics. And things like Fourier transform always has this duality between frequency and time. And you can't have perfect representation in both. Yeah, but I'm a bit lost. Is this still the content of?
Yeah, maybe I actually skipped too much, so maybe I'll just go back to this, previous paper. But anyway, so then the rest of the paper, maybe I'll just close about Georgiev paper first. So Georgiev and also hammer of penrose kind of idea goes from sort of the dichotomy of the consciousness and behaviors in the classical and the quantum, and then both of them basically suggest some kind of quantum phenomena has to explain consciousness side from their intuition. And then Hameroff and the Penrose case, they talk about this, quantum collapse of these dendrites and microtubule and so on that happens at this objective or reduction thing. And then this Georgiev case, he talks about this, solitons passing through this, synapses and so on, which I don't really understand. But he basically talks about biomolecules of certain energy cannot pass the boundary if it's, classic, but if it's quantum, then it can pass the boundary or something like that. So that was pretty much the end of the contents of these two papers. And then what I wanted to discuss was that along this state and measurement issue of the consciousness, even for the brain, I'm not really sure whether the state and the measurements are clearly sort of definable. Like from the activity state or anatomy or time scale and memory, if you think about all of this, then one shot of the measurement of the brain, can we really characterize the state of the brain? I'm not really sure. So if we think about the state of the brain as something that is accessible from particular type of the measurement, then what this paper and Georgiev suggests may be correct, in fact. Right? We just can't characterize the state of the brain as something like classical physics would assume. Right? There is an already definitive kind of state, and some measurement can be minimized, arbitrarily small, and then everything is deterministic. But if you take more quantum like sort of that perspective, then brain itself has this property that the measurement itself affects on itself. And but the measurement in the brain starts to become really weird if you think about it, because he talks about it in that towards the end of the second quantum information paper, which also relates to what Kavan said. If you think about neuron as an entity, and then synaptic contact to the postsynaptic neuron or presynaptic neuron as a measurement, then all this state of the neuron is always measured by some other entity, right? And that reduces, that collapses the state of this system all the time. But does it make sense? I actually don't know. And as a sort of the external agent, that Kavan talked about, if we, as a sort of experimenter, measure brain or neural activity through EEG or neural recording, does it actually matter as a measurement? I actually don't know. And one way to think about this, all of this, is that maybe this Bell inequality kind of measurement or tests to see whether there is like a violation of the Bell inequality in some way. So that's what I wanted to kind of discuss here.
I think it's, I think there's a big leap there, and this is what I felt reading his paper, in the sense that what I think it was Ben who said this about chaos. Brain is a massive classical object. Let's assume it's classical for the moment. And unless you know it extremely precisely, there's no way for you to predict what it's going to do, and therefore you can't classify its state precisely, because it might be chaotic at some level. So in a sense, you don't need quantum mechanics to make it impossible to measure that the state of the brain. But maybe it's not even important, because does it really matter? Do we need to know all of the microscopic details in order to say something about the current conscious experience, which is in a way macroscopic?
No, I don't think we need to. Yeah, so I tend to agree with what you said, probably. But so my point is that Yeah, something like what you said, probably. So this idea, quantum cognition, is quite promising, I think, in this respect. So quantum cognition kind of literature doesn't suggest that quantum-like behaviors in terms of judgment or bias and so on does not need to arise from the brain's quantum effects itself. But completely classical effects of the brain can or needs to generate this type of the quantum-like effects, like order effects of measurement of A to A then B is different from B then A, and this is all based on the classical brain operation and so on. And but the important thing, lesson from that is that many of the assumptions that we make, like state of the consciousness is one point in some high dimensional space, may not be valid, but rather state of the system may be better conceived as a vector or whatever in Hilbert space, and then to think about measurement like quantum system. But I'm not saying that we need to go directly there, because many of the consciousness and also other behaviors do not behave like this quantum cognition, and that's something that I also wrote somewhere. Yeah. Yeah, so this is again my view and the alternative. I don't think measurement always affects and always result in this asymmetry in the case of a consciousness, because it's most of the case it's macroscopic and there is no asymmetry or non-commutativity, but we do observe something like that in certain cases. And this attention or report resistance type of the property of the consciousness may be something similar to center thing in the quantum mechanics, right? Where those kind of thing doesn't actually get affected by the order of the measurement and so on. And there are such a thing in the also consciousness or cognition there. And many of the things has been studying on this type of the property. I don't know whether that answered your question, or maybe I spoke too much other things.
No, I think we're in agreement. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Is there any other comments or question?
There's a question in the chat.
Maybe who is Ariel first?
Okay, my question's from a while back. It's kind of not the most important question, I think, relative to other ones people might have, but I'm just more confused about, like, when we talk about measurement, we're often talking about like psychophysics and like taking measurements from participants, or we're talking about an individual subject introspecting and like measuring their own sort of states. But I'm just wondering if, like, does it count as measurement just to have experiences at all in the first place? Like, is consciousness by definition almost like a measurement in a sense, or is there some distinction between having experiences and like measuring experiences in some way? I guess I'm a bit unclear on the terminology there.
Having experience itself already involves measurements.
Well, insofar as people often talk about how experiences are about something, or they like transfer information, or they're about information, it seems to be like measuring something in a sense. I don't know. I just wondered what. I'm very happy to be told no, like it doesn't count. I'm unclear on it.
I don't know. And based on what Kavan said, if we define measurement as something that acts on something from some kind of external entity acts, does on something, then it doesn't make sense, right? I don't know. Kavan, do you have any idea?
I'm not sure I fully understood the question, Ariel. Can you try again?
Sorry. So
No.
I'm just saying that, so when we're talking about measurement in consciousness, we often talk about taking behavioral data, so that's doing measurement from a third person perspective, or performing introspection on our own experiences. So in a sense, measuring from a first person perspective. But it seems to me that to have an experience is typically to have some sort of content or to have an experience of something. So whether it's like a visual experience or an auditory experience or an introspective experience, and in a sense, it seems to be like measuring information that is present or like present to the subject in some way. And so I'm wondering if just like, is it the case that any experience is in a sense a kind of measurement, or is there a distinction between like an introspective experience that involves measurement and experiences that don't involve measurement in some fundamental way? I'm just a bit confused about the terminology, I think, or the philosophy. I'm not sure which.
I think this is definitely not in my ballpark. But I will say that you could imagine an entity that is completely disconnected from the world in a way, but still has a conscious experience.
Yeah, like dreaming or hallucination.
Well, can you?
Yeah.
It's still measuring in a sense, like the states it's taking in. It's still measuring. It's like insofar as it has variation in experience, it like measures the system that is producing its conscious experience.
Well, I mean, imagine you get yourself in a spacesuit and are thrown out in deep space, and now you see absolutely nothing around you except for black body radiation. So you have no causal connection to the rest of the universe other than what universe throws at you, which is minimal. But you could still have a conscious experience until you run out of oxygen or whatever.
Well, I guess I'm just saying, and I'll leave it here because I don't want to sidetrack the conversation further. It seems you would still be, in a sense, the experiences you have would be like related to the physical states your brain were in, or in some sense, in that there would be measurement in that sense. But I'm probably confusing everyone, including myself. So I'll let other people ask questions.
Can I just add something to that?
Yep.
So based on I briefly went through this paper, and I've read a related, his is one of his related previous works as well. So at least from the perspective that he is presenting, it seems to me that he is, so the first person experiences, he does not count that as measurement, because he's saying these are incommunicable, right? So measurement, so if they were measurements, that there would be two effects, right? One is they would kind of collapse the wave function, which he never mentions about that. So he doesn't suggest that. So in other words, the first-hand experience is identified with the coherent quantum state, the entangled quantum state, and having a sense about redness of rose and so on and so forth. These are not measurements, otherwise they would have collapsed this wave function. So and so that's one. And second, if they were measurements, they would be also communicable, right? And the other thing, that the third person measurements that you mentioned earlier about like observations about behavior from outside, from his perspective, they all seem to be classical measurements, because the information that is communicable about our first-hand experience is all classical. So those measurements also don't disturb this internal quantum state, whatever that might be. At least this is what I understood.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's correct. Oh, and consistent with my understanding, I think. Maybe I said something wrong, but yeah, that's what I think. I agree. So maybe Beth?
Yeah, I had a comment rather than a question. I just thought it would be helpful to mention that with quantum cognition, they're also not claiming that they can, this can like model all of our behavior. It's just some instances that quantum cognition can explain, and they're happy to accept that a lot of our behavior can be modeled with like more classical probability and things like that. So I just thought that might be important to mention.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. And I think, you know, this thing, right, you know, this center thing, I think that's the thing that we need to introduce to consciousness field, where something does, you know, behave like classical, you know, logic, classical, you know, probability, but when there is some kind of, you know, interference, we do see these effects.
So I mean, I think it's good to have that nuanced perspective, and I appreciate that comment, but I don't see the need for quantum mechanics for any of it a priori. And the case made seems in Georgiev's paper seems to me that it's pretty weak, because it relies on some peculiar features of quantum mechanics which put a stricter fundamental bound than classical information theory can. But that's not to say that classical information theory does not allow for hiding information, or, you know, have some effective level of privacy.
Yeah, there's not a compelling case for it other than these very vaguely abstracted conceptual similarities between consciousness being measured or not, or like there's no reason to invoke, to me, or at least there's not enough of an argument made. To me, the best reading is that there are some qualitative similarities in our experience of consciousness and quantum mechanics, but not that there's a compelling reason to think that they're mechanistically relevant to consciousness.
Yeah, so that's also something I wanted to kind of, you know, imply, right? I mean, this, you know, this is all based on kind of intuition, which is okay as a starting point. But I agree that, you know, there's no strict or, you know, a very concrete case where we do need this, you know, quantum information theoretic kind of interpretation, right? Yeah, so I agree that that's the part that I also find it's weak.
So this is
and sorry, Kevin.
No, go on. They go after.
Oh, I was just going to. And there was also this interesting remark made by someone earlier about classical statistical mechanics, right? So this, I mean, not having access, like complete access to something can happen due to two reasons, right? So in quantum mechanics, it happens because that's the structure of the theory, so that there's something intrinsic there. But this kind of thing also happens in classical statistical mechanics just because of the presence of too many degrees of freedom. So this inner privacy experience, I mean, the other thing it could map onto is just it being like too many degrees of freedom. Like you just have the sense of, the privacy thing might just be synonymous with there being too many degrees of freedom that are required to model this internal state. So yeah, I mean, I'm just kind of like, I just wanted to highlight the remark made by someone else previously, which is that there's just no reason why this privacy feeling is intrinsic in the sense of quantum mechanics.
I agree. And that probably also addresses the question from William. Are there any other example of classical systems that are better modeled with the quantum theory? That's not really quite, but that are classical systems that are also private. That's what you said, Suki, right? I guess.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And sorry, can I ask a quick question? And unrelated to the present discussion. So this is for the consciousness experts, but it's probably more on the philosophy side. Is there a distinction between and I think it's also, my question was triggered by a remark by made by someone else. So it seems that it's always like you're conscious of something, right? A rose or a smell or whatever. Is there ever a distinction either from the study and a medical approach to studying the brain as a basis for consciousness, or even a philosophy of consciousness, between being conscious of something versus just being conscious? Like, is there anything, is there a concept of being conscious without being conscious of something, or without referring to the object of consciousness?
Yeah, so that's actually, you know, there's a big, sort of not really debate, but there are large distinction between this, you know, transitive and also intransitive usage of the conscious. As you said, that, you know, like when you are conscious, just as a sort of, in the sense of awakeful, compared to anesthetized or and so on, it's sometimes called a level of consciousness. And people do talk about, you know, regardless of the contents, if you are conscious, then that's conscious. And another things, most of the sort of neuroscientific studies and psychological studies of consciousness is usually to manipulate the stimulus. So it's a conscious of something. But so there people are trying to distinguish between those, and there are sort of the corresponding kind of, you know, neural correlates or neural mechanism for each, in a sense. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that.
All right. Did Oliver wanted to say something?
Yeah, I guess I'm not entirely sure if I understood this whole thing, that quantum mechanics and consciousness are definitely not my background. But I thought his main argument for saying why we needed quantum mechanics comes down to, in one of the papers, that's like the second or third page, he talks about causal reductionism and functionalism, effectively saying that because, well, some people consider consciousness to be an emergent property, and some people consider it to be physically kind of constrained. I was just kind of wondering what your opinion was now on whether or not it's an emergent property or whether it needs to have some kind of physical basis.
Yeah, so that's the part that I also didn't understand very well. But he sort of a contrast between Hameroff's view and his view, and along that kind of comparison, I think he does talk about something like what you said. I think I might have missed it.
Effectively, I think the argument was, if it's just an emergent property, how does it have feedback and some kind of evolutionary advantage? Like, why do we feel sad when we have some kind of disadvantage given to us? Effectively, that was the kind of argument. And he was saying that given that we can have functional behaviors already without consciousness, I guess moving our hands to defend ourselves from being hit or something like that is how I interpret it. Why do we need consciousness? So it's not just a functional or kind of emergent property, which I would personally disagree with, because I would have thought you can have all kind of hierarchies of functional or emergent properties. Like you could have it on the scale of nanoseconds or milliseconds, microseconds, up to weeks and months and years. And the weeks and months and years could be more of a conscious emergent property. Whereas at the nanoseconds or milliseconds, it would be kind of this small scale emergent property. I don't know if that really...
It's kind of interesting, but it's separate, completely separate from this paper. And I wrote a little blog on that kind of issue in Japanese. So I can't actually link it to you. But there I was talking about the difference between the difference of the perspectives between the structuralism versus functionalism. And in the functionalism, you talk about the meaning of things from, when you especially talk about, evolution or development and things like that, you explain things because this is useful, this is functional for whatever purpose, right? Like, there's a value, and valuable things are valuable because it is useful, and so on. But this kind of explanation is just wrong in many ways empirically, in my opinion. The value is, from the structuralism viewpoint, something that is exchanged starts to gain value. So when the exchange happens, then the value also starts to emerge. And that's the reason why, completely useless thing can become extremely expensive, valuable, right? And something similar also happens for the communication. It's not like we communicate to achieve something, but rather because we communicate, we form the society, and then the society dictates something and so on. So something similar is also probably happening in terms of consciousness as well. I think it's not that we evolved particular sense of consciousness to survive. It's more like the opposite way, or at some point, through the evolution, this kind of optimization or requirement for the survival of functionalism starts to become much looser in terms of requirement, and starts to become more like satisfaction. There is this different kind of view about evolution. One is the optimization, which I don't think makes sense in many ways, on the functionalism, and another one is the satisfaction. Once you can live, then you can have the function that you already gained without discarding, and that's probably more closer to reality, I imagine. I don't know whether that makes sense to you.
But it doesn't seem like either of those would be an argument for why it needs to be physically embedded, like he's mentioning in this paper, right?
Yeah, but it
Either
doesn't actually, require that, something has to evolve to do something.
Yeah, not sure.
Not sure. Okay.
I just thought that might have been one of his arguments for why you need quantum mechanics, was this whole, it's not an emergent property kind of thing.
The term emergent property is also very vague and so difficult kind of concept, but yeah, maybe we should talk about it at a different time.
Yeah.
Can I also ask, so it was an interesting remark that evolution need not, like this kind of this other view of evolution, that need not just favor things that are functional, like need not kind of develop capacities that are always functional. But in case of consciousness, I mean, and he makes this point as well, like that consciousness he seems to be kind of taking this, no, okay, sorry. So let me not say that. So let me go back. But is it too hard to imagine that consciousness actually has a function, that, I mean, that being like, or like we have an internal representation of the world, and that is in some sense helps us optimize our interaction with the world. Like, and one way of thinking about consciousness is just like we have an internal representation of the world, right? Like some kind of a map, some kind of the question of whether it, or how strongly it corresponds to what's actually out there, that's a different question. But our experience of the world is maybe just a kind of a map for optimizing our interaction with the world, and that doesn't seem very unreasonable, right? Or is there some argument against that? I mean, I'm saying that because, I mean, then that sense would be favored by evolution, right?
Yeah, so I totally agree with that. But what I'm saying is that I'm not arguing that consciousness is never functional or never useful, right? But what I'm saying is that there is no single single sort of perspective that makes all the usefulness, all the functions potentially consciousness can have, in an equal foot. Like if you imagine like a simulation environment of artificial agents, and then you want to quantify the fitness of that agents, then you need to quantify the usefulness of functionalistic functions or degree of the optimization, or the fit of the survival, or something like that from a single viewpoint, God viewpoint, right? What I'm saying is that that kind of viewpoint is not super useful, or maybe not even doesn't exist, because some of the functions are there from one particular perspective, but not from the other perspective. And it's not like, it's easy to sort of universally, give a value for each of them, like, fitness function. And rather than thinking about that, structuralistic kind of thinking tries to describe this system, including this functionalistic assessment from many different viewpoints, as a single coherent kind of entity. And when the perspective does not cohere together, then this kind of incompatibility arises. I don't know whether I'm making sense or not, but that's what I try to mean. Okay.
Yeah, no, I'm not sure I fully followed the argument, but I did catch your gist, I believe. Are you kind of implying that the development of the evolutionary development of consciousness does not necessarily does not necessarily maximize the fitness function? Like it could be, so I mean, so it doesn't maximize it.
Yeah, I don't think so. That's something that I would say yes, because many of the animals would be probably differently conscious about the world according to their niche, and also many animals are successful on their own way, right? Like it's called the Umwelt. Like ticks are optimized in their own environment, but not really like optimized in terms of consciousness. Flies are also like that, and so on. So what do you mean by optimizing with respect to the environment is unclear to me. Humans, like for the blind people, I don't know. Maybe that's not a relevant kind of discussion, but maybe, okay, let's stop for now, but let's go to the next question. Angus?
Yes, so I'm not sure if I've properly thought through this, but can you get to quantum mechanics or use a quantum description for a classical system? Because it seems like in the earlier discussion, the overall attitude is we might need some sort of quantum description of consciousness or something, but physically it's not necessarily the quantum mechanics like what he's proposing, like stuff happening at the picosecond scale. I'm not sure if that question makes sense.
If what you mean by the quantum mechanics as a sort of the non-commutative kind of operation, mathematical models that underlies this cognition, consciousness, and so on, and also thinking about the interaction between the states of consciousness and the measurement, whatever it is, let's assume for the moment attention or report as a measurement, and if the measurement affects on the state, and if that to model that or to explain that we need this kind of non-commutative algebra, then I would say that yeah, we need to probably think about it that way, because idea of this thing, state of a system or consciousness as a point in the space, a high dimensional space, which is very popular among the philosophers. Okay, redness of the red is defined as a point in 3D space like this one, and then the perceived similarity between the redness and orange is just a distance between these. This is a kind of default assumption that many philosophers and also many of us actually have. And this kind of presume that the state of consciousness is something like a geometric object in a high dimensional whatever space. But that kind of idea is just inconsistent with what we have as an experimental evidence. And equally, comparing kind of, idea comes from the quantum cognition, I think, which is that, state of the conscious experience may be better thought as, one ray in this, similarly high dimensional space. And then the similarity between these, two different experiences, just, angle difference between the two. And then that explains many things. And if that level of the explanation is something that you think about in quantum mechanics or quantum mathematics, I would say yes.
Okay, and then I have a follow-up question, which is kind of related to one of the dot points in one of the slides, but would you see integrated information theory like in the realm of classical sort of type theory?
I think so.
Because one thing which has never really been clear to me about integrated information is what the information actually is. So I don't know if, because probably many of people here aren't that familiar with integrated information theory, but like with information, there's always like some sort of probability distribution, and you have some sort of particular state. But after reading this Georgiev paper, I was thinking maybe we can actually consider state to be the probability distribution into the, so you have some system which is in some observable state. But then the information to the system is not the state itself, but rather the probability distribution specified by that state. And in that sense, can we kind of like I'm not saying this is valid, but could we potentially operationalize integrated information in terms of like this quantum mechanical stuff? So like the state of the system, this unobservable state of the system is these probability distributions, and maybe these correspond to like this wave function or something. I don't know, because I don't really know quantum mechanics.
Yeah, so because I don't know about that, I can't also say yes or no.
Okay.
But yeah, so if somebody here understands both IIT and so quantum information theory, then that would be perfect person to answer this question.
Well, has anyone tried to read, is it McQueen, Kelvin, who wrote the quantum IIT? I feel like there's 3 or 4 quantum IIT papers by now.
Kelvin's, a paper, at least I've seen a couple of, talks from Chalmers and so Kelvin himself, but it's all about, measurement issue. It's not something to do with what Angus was talking about.
I'll go hunting. I think
it's more to do with probably, a quantum field theory version of the IIT, right?
Yeah, I feel like I have seen a one that's more related to what Angus was talking about, but maybe I'm misremembering the author.
My understanding of Kelvin's stuff, based on like a talk he gave some while ago, is that his work with Chalmers is more to do with consciousness causing collapse of the wave function or something like that.
Right.
But my idea was more to do with like actually going into integrated information and operationalizing it in terms of like wave function being the state or something.
I know. I was thinking of, sorry. Has anyone?
Adam Barrett, right?
Oh, the Zanardi paper as well. So like I've got there's a few of these now. It's just what I like. I think I've seen 4 or 5 of them. But
I think also Kavan also found some paper before, but yeah, there are some papers. Yes.
I think it's the one by Zanardi, which is probably pretty solid. I mean, Zanardi's a solid quantum physicist.
This one.
Yeah. I mean, we could ask him to speak about it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that would be actually interesting for me as well. So I could reach out to him.
All right. If nothing else, then let's wrap up. Thank you very much, everybody, for contributing. It was great, interesting.
Thanks now.
All right.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks all.
Yeah. All right. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.